Hi, everyone. My name's Tammy Harris. I am the founder and executive director of the Ursus Institute. So we work both locally and abroad to fight human trafficking. For my background, I know that your professor has my bio on hand. However, to give you a little bit of background on my experience, I have worked with NGOs in the past who have given housing and restoration to female adult victims of sex trafficking. So, what this means is that once a survivor is identified and comes out of the life of human trafficking, she or he is placed ideally in restorative services. Now, most victims do not receive these services because they're so hard to come by. There's very few restoration services in the whole country, let alone the world, that understand trauma informed care for victims of sex trafficking, and where you learn a little more year after year about the services that are needed for victims of sex trafficking. However, the NGO that I was with prior to starting Ursus actually received, the victim would receive trauma informed care for about a year before he or she moved on to a more independent way of living. It was with this work as the director of development and someone who worked hand on with the victim that I began to see areas of human trafficking that were not being addressed, and that we really needed to tackle certain niches if we were going to be more successful in this fight. So while I was with a home that provided the care for about a year, I noticed that once the survivor left these conditions, that he or she were more likely to actually go back into the life of prostitution, drug addiction, and other dysfunctional relationships due to the lack of resources and support that were no longer available to the survivor. So the NGO that I was with, the non-government organization that I was with, provided these services, um, which dealt with mental health, survivor identification, because so many victims do not self-identify when they first come out of the life of human trafficking. They see themselves as willing participants in um, the process of being trafficked. A lot, especially in the United States, of the victims see human trafficking as a means to an end to survive. A lot of our victims come out of foster care, don't have resources, are befriended and loved by their perpetrators. They feel a sense of family. And so, if you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, um, the victim, well, the perpetrator will attack the need that is not being met for that victim. And so the victim feels that this perpetrator can provide what they need to survive, and that again, the victim feels that they need to participate in order to meet ends meet, so to speak. So if we think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a child who does not have food security, does not have housing security, these are potential victims. So someone coming out of foster care, again, lacks those senses of security with housing and food security. Yet most of the research suggests that in the United States, the number one reason for a victim being exploited is actually the need for love and belonging. So if you think of children at a very vulnerable age, 12, 13, 14, who are looking for their own identity, looking for someone to care for them, to give them that true feeling of belonging in this world. You know, social media by teens right now is really utilized as a way to connect with others who they feel are like-minded, to give them a sense of purpose. So when a 12 or 13 or 14-year-old girl or boy is putting out on social media that they feel lonely, their parents don't understand them, their friends, whatever, use them, there are perpetrators that pretend that they are the age of the child or a few years older and then exploit that child and coerce them to do things that they would not normally do under normal circumstances or knowing the full picture. So we have these 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old children who basically put their life story out on social media and then are exploited by these perpetrators. So again, these victims feel like they are going willingly into the world of sex trafficking. So most of the people, and we worked with women at this particular nonprofit that felt like they went willingly, felt like they deserved the life that they had. And so even after self-identifying, going through rehab, doing neural remapping, there was still a drop-off in being able to stay out of that life. So when I was with this NGO, I realized that more services were needed. I noticed that we were identifying domestic survivors, but not international survivors. I noticed also that legislation is going to be a big key in this fight, and we are really state by state. I think every state could identify and should identify areas in the fight against trafficking that are not being addressed. So have given input into legislation, working with a particular General Assembly member right now about some legislation. So it's really an ongoing process. Right now, we've been working on a state level, but I'm hoping to do eventually more federal legislation to help nonprofits, to help victims, to help with the conviction rates of perpetrators. So those are kind of bucket list things that Ursus really wants to work on. So seeing legislation that's lacking, seeing victim services that are lacking. And if we even go back to data, we'll see that less than 1% of victims are ever identified and ever even come out of the world of trafficking. So we really need to do more with law enforcement training for healthcare professionals, anyone who would come in contact with a potential victim, so that we can identify and pull them out, because like I said, they're very unlikely to see a 1-800 number and then self-identify to call that 1-800 number. That we're starting to post more within the communities for victims to call if they are in danger. So if they're not self-identifying, they're not using that number to come out of the life. So really it's up to the community to identify these victims and to understand what human trafficking really looks like, so that we can be the boots on the ground to pull them out. So it's this need for education. It's this need for additional funding. It's this need for victim services. It's this need to pull out more international victims and not just identify domestic victims, and the need for data. So when I work on pieces of legislation, the General Assembly members who may or may not be educated on sex trafficking, human trafficking, want to see data and numbers for the realities of trafficking. And if we don't have substantial unbiased data, which we are really lacking right now, then it's going to be very difficult to change any type of legislation when it comes to human trafficking. So if we just look to conviction rates for perpetrators I'm in Mecklenburg County, you're going to see very few convictions, which is going to paint a very biased picture of human trafficking. And if those who are making laws don't understand how difficult it is to convict someone of human trafficking, they may believe that we don't have a problem with sex trafficking or human trafficking in a given area. So what we need to do is educate others on how difficult it is to convict a trafficker, why most victims don't want to take the stand against their perpetrators, how dangerous it is for a victim to take the stand against a perpetrator, and really an array of reasons of why the conviction rates for human trafficking are so low. Even knowing that most perpetrators actually plead down to lesser charges is very important. So I've been working with a local university to do prevalence studies on trafficking to show the realities using other data. And what can we use to show trafficking other than conviction rates of perpetrators? So that's another project that we're working on. You may be familiar with the Polaris Project, which gathers data based on, one of the things they do is gather data based on those who call in either as victims or those who see trafficking. So we have to take even that data with a grain of salt, knowing that most people do not know trafficking when they see it. And even if they think that something is a little amiss in a relationship that they're viewing, they may not identify it as trafficking, so never call the number. And again, we've talked about how most victims do not self-identify, so they themselves are not going to call. So when we look at the numbers that Polaris provides, even though it's a gauge of trafficking going on, it's not completely unbiased. And so to have more unbiased data is really the key to making changes in legislation, to getting additional funding, to being able to educate the community on the realities, especially those who are more likely than others to see a victim, such as law enforcement agents, nonprofit organizations, sexual assault nurses, and really those in the healthcare profession in general. I believe I've read that about 80% of all victims go into the hospital or see a doctor at some point while they are being trafficked. And so to have this segment of the population educated is very important in the fight. So I decided to branch off from a different nonprofit about 2 years ago, started the Ursus Institute, and we have begun to tackle these segments, these niches that were not previously addressed. And so in doing so, we have done work locally as well as internationally in the fight against human trafficking. I've participated in intel investigations as well as rescue operations. And so they are very eye-opening, and it's very important to speak to survivors and even those in the life currently to gain a reality of human trafficking. What social media platforms are being used, where are girls and guys being sold, what are perpetrators using. I'm not sure if you were familiar with Backpage. One of the first things that Donald Trump did as president was to take down Backpage, which was a huge win for us because Backpage was a place where children were sold legally online in the United States. And Donald Trump, I believe it was within his first 2 or 3 months in office, if I remember correctly, or maybe it was the year after he was in office, he was able to take down Backpage. So that was a big win. But when you push down, you have the push down pop-up method, right? So Backpage being taken down, which we can't allow to occur in our country. We can't allow almost like a Craigslist of selling of children taking place on US soil. But the reality is, if you're pushing down, the perpetrators are going to pop up somewhere else. So where are they popping up, right? So this is something that we also need to tackle. Currently, we're going through this coronavirus. So we're seeing chatter on the dark web actually go down due to fear of the disease. So my intel is telling me that, I guess luckily, since we're not able to be boots on the ground as easily in places like the Dominican Republic, where they have curfews right now due to the coronavirus, that at least we know that chatter is gone down. So there's that connection between parties and celebrations and sporting events that connect, and prevalence and instances of trafficking go up. But now we're seeing with our own eyes that in times of distress, in times of disease and sickness, that at least right now, as this one incident is occurring, we're seeing chatter on the dark web go down. So it would be interesting to study this a little bit further and discuss, because I know that I go to the Dominican Republic a lot during times of higher prevalence. So for them, that would be around Christmas. Actually, Christian holidays are big drivers for sex trafficking. So now we know, at least in these places of vacation spots, when there is higher rates of disease or uncertainty, demand drops. So what does that look like in the United States? Are we going to be seeing the same things? We know that for us, different in Charlotte, sporting events drive demand up. So long-term data analysis, be interesting to see if their fear of sickness as well curbs demand for trafficking. So I know that your professor has the PowerPoint that I have shared with her in regards to Ursus, what we do. So you can refer to that presentation either while I continue to speak or after my talk, and I will just refer to that for a few key points. I'm not sure if in your studies you've talked about how sex trafficking is defined, and each country has defined it a little differently in different years. But in the United States, in the year 2000, we had the Trafficking Victims Protection Act passed. So what the Trafficking Victims Protection Act does is define sex trafficking with an action means purpose model. To show trafficking, to prove trafficking in the court of law, you need to have, if the victim is over 18, you need, it's called AMP. You need the act. So for example, the recruitment of someone into sex trafficking would be the act. The means is force, fraud, or coercion. And for someone who is under 18, you do not need to show means. You do not need to show force, fraud, or coercion to prove sex trafficking if the victim is under 18. However, over 18, you have to show means. So the purpose would be sexual exploitation, forced labor, anything that falls under the umbrella of human trafficking. So if someone is recruiting someone under 18 for the purpose of commercial sex acts, you do not need to show force, fraud, or coercion. There is not, I believe, gosh, I'm not sure if there's any more states, but very recently there were many states that still would prosecute a child under 18 for prostitution, which should never occur. No child who is under 18 should ever be arrested or convicted for prostitution. And we at the Ursus Institute even realized that the connection between prostitution and sexual abuse prior to 18 is very highly correlated. And so we would like to see more and more awareness and less convictions for prostitution. We know at least data suggests that about 98% of all victims of trafficking have actually been exploited sexually before their 18th birthday. So for us, we would like to see less convictions of prostitution and more of an understanding of the realities of sex trafficking. If someone is recruited at 12, 13, 14, they're not going to self-identify and be able to feel like they can escape sex trafficking just because they have their 18th birthday. So we would like to see criminal charges against trafficking victims decrease and convictions for those related to trafficking perpetrators, pimps, johns. Johns are the ones who purchase sex, be more on the rise. So while I don't fully personally agree with all aspects of the Nordic model, it would be interesting for you as students to read more about the Nordic model and see what they're doing in the countries such as Sweden and Norway in the fight against trafficking and in the fight against convicting and almost decriminalizing prostitution. I believe it's dangerous to completely decriminalize prostitution because in countries where there is, in places where there are legalized prostitution, it actually raises demand for human trafficking, and instances of human trafficking actually go up. So it's a real slippery slope, and you have to be careful how we treat laws and the implications of those laws down the road. So I believe there needs to be more understanding within law enforcement to recognize and see victims of trafficking so that they can receive the trauma-informed care that they need. However, legalizing prostitution, decriminalizing prostitution actually raises demand. So that could be a completely separate presentation all in itself, between that connection between legalized prostitution, raising demand in human trafficking, and really more victimization of children because of those laws. So Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the United States, very new law, federal law, very new state to state. Things are, you can go on the Polaris website and see the different grades that states receive due to their fight against human trafficking. And they even give a list of the most prevalent cities, the most prevalent states for human trafficking, which I say take with a grain of salt, just because one state is ranked 49 or 50 or 48 does not mean that they don't have human trafficking. It may mean that those in that state don't recognize trafficking when they see it. So, for example, North Carolina is a top 10 state. Charlotte is number 1 in the state for trafficking. And trafficking does go on here. Trafficking is prevalent. However, are we really worse than state number 45 for trafficking? Or does state number 45, 44, do they not have the resources in place or the education in place to see trafficking for what it is? So data needing to see and kind of work through the realities of numbers and take things with a grain of salt. I don't care if North Carolina is 7,550. I know that trafficking is prevalent. I know that we need to do more work, and that won't change whatever number we are on a Polaris or given site for prevalence. That will not change my drive to educate, change laws, help to increase funding, these sorts of things. So numbers, you really need to take them with a grain of salt and know that some states have done more in the fight against trafficking than others. So, and I know states that are lower on that poll that are really trying hard to grasp what they should be doing better. So moving on to the next slides, if you have them in front of you, they talk about the connection between pornography and sex trafficking. I think that is something that's really not discussed as much as it should be. The role of pornography in, I mean, there's many aspects of this. So you have the fact that those who engage in pornography, study after study have shown and proven that the more one engages in pornography, the more likely they are to go out and purchase sex. And also there's the fact that many women and men in the pornography industry are actually victims themselves of sex trafficking. And so just the engagement of pornography helps promote human trafficking and sex trafficking. So a lot of individuals feel that what they do in their home is their business, yet in the purchasing of pornography, you are actually helping to create a system, a perpetual system of recruitment and exploitation of sexual trafficking. And there's some really good studies that discuss the connection between those who engage in watching pornography and then go off to actually want to reenact what they see. So that drives up demand for trafficking as well. So if after viewing you want more information about those studies, you can either reach out to me or your professor to receive, I'd be happy to share some of those studies. Some sex trafficking cases. So that's one of the next slides on the presentation. So we could really go on and on about the different potential victims. Victims, like I spoke about earlier in the United States, look a lot different than international victims. So when we are in the Dominican Republic, we're seeing victims who are exploited because of lack of food security, housing security, Haitians that cross the border for more security and then are exploited. We also have rescued victims from Venezuela who believe they're coming to Dominican Republic to work as hotel workers, legitimate work, and then their passports are taken and they're put on the street immediately. In the United States, it's a more methodical process usually. I'm not saying that kidnappings don't happen, because they do. I know of gangs that kidnap children in the United States and then swap them out with kidnapped children in Mexico. So kidnappings do exist. However, I would say the most prevalent way in the United States to traffic a child is called the boyfriending aspect. A child believes they are loved, and like we talked about earlier, they have that sense of love and belonging with the perpetrator, and then the perpetrator, who they think is their boyfriend or their girlfriend, because there are girl perpetrators and pimps as well, who recruit. So the victim feels like this person loves them, they care for them, and then they slowly coerce them to do things that they would not have normally done. A perpetrator in the United States spends about 9 months on average luring the child or person into sex trafficking. So they believe this person loves them, then they need to do X, Y, and Z to keep this person in their life. So, I mean, again, this could be another presentation just on case studies of men and women and how they were trafficked. A lot of the victims I've worked with would tell you that they had great childhoods growing up. They were not couch surfers. They just had a need that wasn't filled, the perpetrator honed in on and exploited. So, we do have victims that aged out of foster care. We do have victims that, for some reason, when they were around the age of 12 or 13, there was a need that just wasn't filled, and the perpetrator exploited that need. We do have victims that, again, another great study is looking at the amount of Native Americans in our country that go missing, and we don't pay attention to that population. So honestly, we could do a full lecture just on case studies of victims and how they were lured into that life, and then how the perpetrators exploited their needs. We even have volunteers and members of my leadership team at Ursus that were trafficked by their husbands and their boyfriends, people that they loved and cared for and had children with. So that is something that we really need to give attention to, the amount of women who believe that they are in loving relationships with their spouse, they have children to care for, and then the spouse will, in a form of domestic abuse, force them into the sex trade. So if you'd ever want a presentation just on case studies, let me know, and we can kind of go through really what different cases look like, especially comparing developing countries versus places like the United States. So something that a lot of people want to know is what to look for. What do we look for as a community to understand trafficking? And, we do presentations for DSS and the nursing community on what they should be looking for. But as people in your day-to-day life in the community, you're looking for children or adults that look malnourished. Most victims are branded, so tattoos. Most victims in a given circumstance will not speak for themselves. They will look to their perpetrator to answer simple questions, things that they should know, their full name, where they were born, where they're going, what they want to eat. They do not feel secure in themselves to answer for themselves, so they will turn to their perpetrator. And again, you need to remember that if you see two women together, that does not necessarily mean that there's not a victim-perpetrator relationship going on. Very many times, either the second female will be the perpetrator, or she will be placed in charge of the girls by the lead pimp. And there's a hierarchy. So seeing a relationship where one person cannot speak for themselves, they are dressed inappropriately, maybe they don't look like they've slept well lately, maybe they look malnourished, like they haven't eaten well, their teeth are usually in poor shape for many reasons. So just having that gut feeling that something is not right in a relationship. So many people say that they don't want to waste the time of law enforcement agents. However, every law enforcement agent that I've ever spoken to has said that they'd rather receive 100 wrong calls than miss that one. So just remember that if you're at a restaurant and you see a relationship just doesn't look appropriate, if you work in an industry where you need to talk in the service industry and someone can't speak for themselves, and like I said, their clothing just doesn't look right for the environment, or they have tattoos, which is something actually, if we talk about branding, it's actually something that usually the victim strives to achieve. So they're proud of their branding. It means that they've made a certain amount of money, they've reached a certain status within the organization. And so while you should not try to intervene or save someone, you could engage in small talk with the potential victim and share that information with law enforcement. There's certain brandings that have to do with different gangs, different status of an organization. So if you were able to share that information with law enforcement by just engaging in small talk with the victim, then you would be able to share that with law enforcement agents who are trained to deal with the given situation. So just calling 911 is really all you need to do if you feel like you have witnessed a potential trafficking incident, or if you know of something in your community that just doesn't feel right, a massage parlor, or other front organizations that maybe you drive by in your day-to-day life that you just feel police should be investigating. You just need to call 911 with the tip. You don't need to leave your information, and then they can follow up on whether or not there is something amiss at the location or within a relationship. So your professor does have my contact information. I'd be glad to follow up with more in-depth information. We kind of did a brief overview on a lot of different aspects of sex trafficking, yet we could get into more depth into certain niches of this industry, such as the pornography industry, the different case studies, the legislation. We could do an hour at least on all of these aspects, the branding, the hierarchy, the difference between developing countries versus the United States, in how sex trafficking looks. So please reach out to me. You are welcome to text me at 704-519-7901 if you'd like me to tell you a little bit more or give you more resources, or if you'd like to become involved as a volunteer. We have volunteers throughout the whole country. We're always in need of help. We are working on a documentary right now. The trailer should be coming out probably in April, that I'd be happy to share with you if you think your university or any organization you are affiliated with would like to show our documentary. I believe it'll be completed this fall. We've had a little bit of setback due to the virus and having to put some of our aspects of our organization that we wanted included in the documentary on hold. But I'm hoping that around November, December, we will be able to start showing the documentary, and the trailer will be ready to distribute, hopefully by mid-April. So please get in touch with me. Let me know if you'd like to help in any aspect, if you would like more information about a certain topic, If you would like resources, I do travel around the country giving talks, so I'd be happy to meet with your organization to talk more. My email address is tammy@ursusinstitute.net, and Ursus is URSUS, and our website is the same, www.ursusinstitute.net. I hope to hear from you. I enjoy speaking on a more personal level with people so that we can engage in conversation and you can ask questions of me that pertain to things that interest you in this field. Again, you can text me anytime at 704-519-7901. And I believe your professor has the rest of my contact information. Tammy@ursusinstitute.net is my email, and I hope to hear from some of you. Thanks for your time, and I hope you learned a little bit more about the realities of sex trafficking, and I hope to hear from you about aspects that may interest you even more, so we can talk more in depth about those issues. Thanks again for your time. I hope you are all feeling well, and we get through this time so that we can meet more in person next time. Thanks again.